Number one, I think we can have two different conversations here, both of which are very important. Conversation number one is, what is some alternative system that we can have which will enable us to have both prosperity and at the same time tradition, linking up to something that was before, not having us be these bugmen. That's number one. Number two, which is something that Gavin was getting at and something that I would like to actually talk about first, is choosing the best out of the worst that we currently have and making sure that whatever we end up choosing isn't going to be something that's going to actually decrease the amount of people that are going to get out of poverty. And just one quick example I wanted to offer back to the Soviet Union, not of the Stalinist 40s and 30s, but of the 70s. So during the 70s, and even before the oil crisis, let's say, the Soviet Union had tons of natural resources. It was an empire. You know, it has so many things that it can utilize, while at the same time, the capital city, St. Petersburg and Moscow, both of them, which you'd expect out of this great big empire to have all the goods you could possibly want, regular people, regular middle-class people couldn't get toilet paper anywhere. We couldn't get basic goods because the actual economic system that was in place did not work. And that brings me again to that question of choosing the best of the worst. And I'd be very interested to hear what Tim has to say about that, as well as Gavin. And then let's go to Peter and Angie.
I just want to quickly interject. Coronavirus happened and I couldn't get toilet paper either, so one little crisis and capitalism sort of crumbles.
For how long?
Yeah, but in the Soviet Union, it wasn't even a crisis. They were just unable to get it.
That is so glib. It's unreal. So glib.
Whoa.
Jules,
it was a joke.
Yeah?
It was a joke.
No, hold on,
you were
Angie,
being lighthearted.
Here's
or
the thing.
was it a joke?
That's pulling like a Jon Stewart, Stephen Colbert bit. I'm sorry, but that is a tactic. That is literally a tactic where people go on and say something and say, it's a joke. It's a joke.
No,
I
was telling.
Okay, guys, let's calm down.
I thought you right.
I think this is how you think about everything you're saying.
That's what I think. Right? No, I thought you right.
I genuinely think everything out of your mouth. You're thinking about the way you just.
I thought the right.
Yeah, the right wing has a sense of humor. Yeah, we know. But
I thought
you're
you were
just bad at
have
telling
a sense
jokes.
Of humor. Well, you guys were supposed to be the ones who are chill and have more levity. I wasn't expecting such sensitivity. I wasn't expecting such sensitivity.
Not if Angie, not if you view Red Wing Twitter. My God, that's
triggered. We just don't think.
I was expecting a little more sense. I wasn't expecting so much sensitivity on a little toilet paper joke. For fuck's sake,
babe, you're just not
it's a bad joke. It was just a bad joke. It's not a macro level. Let's move on. Please.
Yeah, let's go to Tim.
We have to avoid internet blood sports level stuff.
Yes,
so,
we're more civilized than that. Let's go to Tim.
So, I guess fundamentally one of my biggest issues with the concept of shifting gears into a system that allots for making sure there's equal distribution to all involved rather than letting people earn their keep. I can understand the argument that then you get a small collective at the top. Let's say 2%. Let's say 2% ends up controlling the other 98%. And they perpetually develop systems in which if you exclude that group, you are somehow going to be an ist or an ob, and you'll be incapable of participating in the system that 2% perpetuates. We see this happen all over the place. My problem with this is it feeds heavily into what I see as cultural Marxism, in which you need to undermine the nationalist roots of whatever society you're trying to rebuild by demonizing the concepts. Earlier, it was mentioned that the family structure and how important it is. Well, cultural Marxism wants to do away with the nuclear family and do away with the concept of inheritance. And do away with the
it
idea.
doesn't. No, it
doesn't.
I'm
no,
not done talking,
Don't
and you will have your time. Silence. You will have your time. I do not want to be interrupted. It is unbearably rude. Unbearably rude.
Oh God! Oh God!
Guys, that's
the idea is that if my parents
someone's like freaking out
of a crime-ridden area and they develop a system of life they're capable of passing down to me, then I should not be the beneficiary because. And I can understand where the two worlds meet. One in which the Jenkinsons or the Vanderbilts continue to give their children the houses, the property, the physical capital without the ability to maintain the system that built those structures or earned that property. The problem is, you're right, you run into idiots running the show and they believe their last name is their permission to let them continue to hold the keys. That becomes a problem. But I don't think you can settle it by breaking down the doors to their home and giving their furniture out to the community. I think that opens the door to a conflict.
Please don't interrupt. Please don't interrupt.
Shut up. Oh my God, you're insufferable.
I'm good.
It's not just, anyway, I'm not going to get into personal stuff. The idea here is that allowing violence and mob rule to work as a system of reorder, as a system of making sure everyone can get an equal hand instead of making sure everyone has to earn their hand, it not only kills incentive via, for instance, I work with Arbor. There's no reason for me to have to cut wood and give it to people who didn't get up off the couch. If there's something that prevents them from working, sure. And the idea that perhaps like the Vanderbilt shouldn't be given an entire city block because their great-great-great-grandfather happened to have enough capital at the time to invest in that entire city block. Well, the name or the act of building it does not guarantee you the right to continue to own it. But at the same time, it does kind of discourage others from wanting to work up to that level. If you say, well, anyone that has a lot of money, there's no way they've earned it. And anyone that has a lot on their own, there's no way they should be allowed to keep it. And if someone has none and you have 5, you should have 3 and they should have 2. Well, I don't understand how that can function on a logical meritocracy. Now, I do get the anarchist motive to a point. I myself was mohawked. I myself threw bottles at cars. I myself was not a good person for a while because I saw a system that excluded my participation because I was low-born. I saw a system that excluded my existence on an equal tier because I was not of the right family caliber. And I understand what it's like to be born into poverty. I understand what it's like to be in prison. I understand what it's like to be an uncomfortable person in a world that looks down on you. But I also get that how I chose to behave determined how I was going to be treated. And in my opinion, if you don't want to play in the system, if you don't want to participate in any way, you can't complain when the system rolls over you. Now, I'm not saying that the system is stacked in a fair way in an untapered diagram. I'm not saying that it's not unfair. But I am suggesting that perhaps instead of trying to institute entirely new systems, simply cordoning off the rogue elements, holding them to a mirror and making sure everyone understands what they're doing and why it's wrong would get us a little farther. Now, the idea of socialism itself, a national socialism isn't that bad if it wasn't soured by the memories of the last couple times it's been tried. But ultimately, you can't have socialism and communist ideas, Marxist ideas in the same time that you're saying borders don't exist and national identity doesn't exist and inheritance can't exist. Because not only, in my opinion, does it kill meritocracy, but it removes the urge for one to participate. Because if you don't exist beyond...
You're talking to a straw man.
I'm not talking to a straw man.
Actually,
I've never heard the chat, no borders, no walls, no USA at all. I'm referring to problems in my own country first, admittedly.
Okay, here's how we're going to do this.
The next person.
Okay, here's how we're going to do this from now on. Angie, here's how we're going to do this from now on. Somebody speaks, we're going to let them speak, we're going to let them finish, and we're going to be civil. So I'm going to make sure that we do that. And also we have Arash Kolaki joining us. Arash, thank you so much for joining us. And you are a left economist writing a book on human nature, potential fulfillment in society. So, and you describe yourself as a libertarian left. Before we go further with this conversation, other than what I just said, I would love to hear a little bit more about you, just a bit. So,
sure. Well, I'm working on a book and doing some research on human nature and society. And the intersection of the two. So in a nutshell, I think you kind of got the gist of what I'm about.
Sounds
excited
good.
To be here.
Excited to have you here. Were you able to listen in on the conversation as it was going on?
No, I'm just joining in cold.
Well, this is going to be a very interesting one. So to bring up what I was talking about before, my 2 things are, number 1, an alternate system that could be come up with, but first focusing on choosing the best of the worst of what we currently have. As I said before, I was originally born in St. Petersburg, Russia. My family came from a whole history of the USSR and all the things that were involved there, including locking people up in mental institutions if they disagree with the government. But that being said, I want to focus more on the economic aspects, and as far as, let's say, having a more economic mobility for the individual. That is something that's very important to me. So this is why I want to get people's takes on that, economic mobility, and let's pass it on to Gavin. Why do you think that under the current system that we have right now, it has the most economic mobility regardless of all the problems in it? And what do you see in any of the systems that have been attempted with a lot more emphasis on socialism, even on the emphasis of Peter, because I know, Peter, you are not a big fan of the government taking taking the power from everybody, right? Like, you want a much more decentralized system. I would love for Gavin, and I would love, Gavin, for you to also comment on that, on whether it is possible to create this more commune, decentralized system, and if not, what are the problems that are standing in the way of it? And I would love for Peter and Arash to respond as well.
Sure, thank you. And just make it quick and easy. I'm not defending the current status quo. I think it's far from perfect, but conceptually, capitalism of all these different economic systems, all these different modes of production, has been proven historically to be the best system to create wealth, to create prosperity, to allow people to rise up social levels of society based on their own merit. Obviously, you could come up with a million different, analogies of, some idiot son of somebody getting into a high position, not through his own merit because of connections, whatever. Sure, but that happens in every system. We're not looking for a utopia. We're not looking for a perfect economic system. We're looking for something that's going to produce the best results for as many people as possible, sort of a utilitarian view of it. And capitalism as a concept is the closest we've ever got to that, and is my belief that it is the best system to achieve the greatest amount of economic and economic prosperity and technological advancement for society as a whole. And again, everything I'm saying here is not a counter to anyone else's specific points. I know we've got drowned out, and that's not my point, or that's not this person's point. I'm just speaking for myself right now. So because of that, you obviously want to have obviously a free market mode of production, and you want to have a system that allows people to make independent decisions, to utilize their own labor, to create their own, have competing different interests, to have incentives, all that kind of stuff. But that doesn't mean capitalism is perfect in and of itself. That doesn't mean the system we have now is perfect in and of itself. There's obviously going to be situations where certain people are going to centralize a lot of power and wealth, where monopolies are going to be created, and we could have a legal system and a government set up that could combat that and counter that, as we've seen throughout history. It's not crazy. I don't think we have to have these absolutes in either direction, where we have to have this pure, utopian ideal of Marxism, or this pure libertarian idea of capitalism. You can have a system where the fundamentals are largely capitalistic, and it's largely based on a free market and incentives, while you still have some sort of structure and legal system to prevent abuse, to prevent overreach, prevent the centralization of power and wealth and resources, like through, say, the tech monopolies, et cetera. So that's my view, and I think that's the majority view of most people on the so-called right, and even in the center, or whatever you want to describe it in the U.S. I think, we've obviously have these neoliberals who are pushing a certain form of sort of corporatist oligarchy, and you have the same type of neoliberals in both parties, Republicans or Democrats. We all seem to agree we hate them based on the earlier discussion, so I'm not going to use them anymore going forward. I do agree with some of the things I've heard Angie and others talk about, sort of in a theoretical, philosophical sense. I didn't necessarily disagree, but the fact remains that wherever you have tried to implement some form of Marxism, please do not interrupt me, anywhere you have tried to implement some form of Marxism, it always devolves into some sort of tyranny. It devolves into sort of an economic destitution. It tramples on people's fundamental rights. And you could always come up with some kind of historical analysis and claim that this commissar was the wrong person at that time in the revolution. They killed this guy off, and all these different millions of different things and historical anecdotes to say why we didn't achieve that utopia. But the fact remains that anytime it's been tried, it always ends up the same way. I know you brought up China earlier, and they're still, treading along. Okay, sure, I'll give you that. But I have not seen a system that was majority or largely capitalist in nature collapse and just completely devolve in any way close to what we've seen communist and Marxist-led nations devolve into. So I just don't see the historical comparisons there where you can point to that's happened. Please don't bring up feudalism or some pre-capitalist, mercantilist, or whatever type of society as a comparison, because that's intellectually dishonest. So that's my basis. I think honestly we all want the same ends for the most part. I do think we all have a disdain for neoliberalism. Sorry, I don't know. I'm talking for 5 minutes. Excuse me. But anyway, that's the shtick.
I don't think she meant you.
Oh, okay, good. I was going to get...
I would love for Arash to comment on what Gavin was talking about.
Sure. Well, there's definitely a lot to unpack. First, I'd say, regardless of whether we think we can improve upon capitalism, I think it's important to start at least with a fair assessment of it, a fair assessment of its benefits and a fair assessment of its failures. So when looking at some of its failures, there's a lot we can look at. For one, it's undemocratic, right? I mean, this is not anything that should really come as a surprise. Most capitalist workplaces are not run democratically. They're run in a top-down fashion. Then we have a market system, right? And markets, by definition, are also undemocratic. The reason why they're undemocratic is because buyers and sellers can decide upon transactions regardless of the effects of that transaction on anybody else in society. And economists have pointed out through both positive and negative externalities that markets inherently, because they're undemocratic, inherently will lead to environmental destruction. Why? Because when you and I decide whether or not to purchase a good or a service, the costs of the environmental damage that good or service may have on society, either our own society or the earth as a whole, is not taken into account into that price. And so capitalism misprices everything because virtually every item either has a positive or a negative externality. So everything is mispriced. And not only is everything mispriced, but the inherent incentive is to actually further misprice everything. Why? Because as a seller, let's say you're selling some sort of good or service, right? The more you externalize the costs to society of that good or service, the higher your profits will be. So you're incentivized to externalize more costs. As a buyer, you're also incentivized to externalize costs. Why? Because why would you rather pay more for something when you can pay less? Okay, so those built-in costs are being externalized, and that causes what we've seen, over the past 100 years, extreme environmental degradation, and that's inherent to capitalism. Now, again, when I started, I said whether or not we can think of or conceptualize a better system, at least it's important to be honest with what capitalism is good about and what it's bad about, right? So it's undemocratic, it's environmentally destructive, and a third item that I'll point out is that it's inherently unjust. Why is it inherently unjust? Well, on multiple levels. For one, we could start by wages, looking at wages, right? Wages are the price of labor, which are bought and sold on a market system. Markets, prices in markets are reflective of the relative bargaining power of the buyers and sellers. This is an economic fact, right? Prices reflect the relative bargaining power of buyers and sellers. So when the seller of a good or service has more bargaining power, of course, they can increase the price. And when they have less, they can't increase the price. Same thing with buyers, right? So labor, for example, in the United States has not had much increases in bargaining power over the past 40, 50 years, which is why wages have been relatively stagnant. Wages are not reflective of effort. They're not reflective of sacrifice. They're not reflective of time and duration of work. They're not actually reflective of anything we inherently have actual control over. Although, tenuously, we can say that we do have control over some things. But bottom line is that in capitalism, wages are a function of bargaining power. And that's inherently unjust, right? Because our conception of justice and fairness means that we should be rewarded, or we shouldn't be rewarded or punished for things we have no control over, right? Alternatively speaking, we should be rewarded for things we do have control over. Like I said, like effort, sacrifice, how hard we work, how long we work. Those are things that we can control.
What about how smart we work?
I mean, that's so anybody so capitalism is inherently very alienating, right? 80% of workers, right? Because when I started, I brought up the fact that capitalism is inherently undemocratic.
Doesn't mean it's a bad thing. You have tyranny of the majority. I don't know why being democratic is the ideal.
Okay, let me define democracy. Let me define what I mean by democracy, at least. What I mean by democracy is that people should have a say in the decisions that affect their lives in proportion to the degree that they're affected by those decisions. So if a decision only affects you, there should be nobody else who has any right to tell you what to do. That's the heart of libertarian and anarchist philosophy, right?
Can you give an example of something that only affects one individual? Because I can't think of anything offhand.
The color of underwear that I wear. I mean, the color I paint my bedroom.
Well, you led.
Nobody should have the right to tell me what to do if it only affects me, right? But as soon as I want to do something that is now going to affect somebody else, they then should have a say in that decision. Like, I mean, just to make a obviously silly example, right? We believe in freedom, and we believe that people should have control over the decisions that affect their own lives. I don't think anybody here would disagree with that. But should I be able to walk down the street and just punch somebody in the face? Of course not. Why? Because now what I'm deciding to do is affecting somebody else. So at the core or the heart of democracy is who is affected by what, right? Who is affected?
Who determines that, though?
Huh?
Who would determine that, though?
Okay, that's a question that needs to be developed and can be answered. But the ideal, right? The ideal, at least, is that we should have a say in the decisions that affect our own lives in proportion to the degree that we're affected by those decisions. So when we look at, for example, markets, which we talked about earlier, markets take into account buyers and sellers, but they don't take into account anybody else who's affected. So that's what I mean by being undemocratic.
You extrapolate that argument to the fullest. I mean, basically anything anyone does in the marketplace will eventually have some ramifications somewhere. I mean, you led your argument against the capitalist system citing externalities, which in and of themselves could be expanded to include anything. Anything could become an externality, even your underwear, analogy. But before I delve into that, I mean, I know you brought up stagnant wages over the last 40, 50 years. I mean, it's to make that kind of broad statement. I mean, you could look at it specifically, things like, I don't know, monetary policy and massive inflation and printing of from the Federal Reserve. That has led to a lack of purchasing power. That has led to stagnant wages. And,
but there's no denying that this is basic economic theory. In capitalism, wages are bought and sold on a market system.
Yeah, there's
right?
a price
market system
for labor like any other good or good
exactly,
or service.
Just like any other good or service.
So what's wrong with that?
What's wrong with it is that prices in a market system, okay, are reflective of the relative bargaining power of the buyers and sellers. So in the case of wages, okay, the relative bargaining power, who's the seller, right? The vast majority of people are the sellers of labor. Who are the buyers, right? Who are the buyers? Employers, right? Okay, yes. So the relative bargaining power between labor and employers is what determines wages.
Bargaining power is not the only factor. If you produce $10 worth of a good or service in an hour, and you're paid $10 an hour, your price for your labor matches your output. I mean, bargaining power.
There's no correlation. There's no economic.
Then the employer can find somebody who's poor and be like, "Hey, I'll pay you $5 to
yeah,
do $10."
Sure. That's why we can't have. That's why we can't have open borders and mass migration.
There's zero, and you could do the research.
I don't think anyone here advocates for open borders either. There have been quite a few.
Didn't say
There's
anyone
been
did.
quite a few. There's a Marxist critique of that, but
Good, I'm
there've
glad.
been
I
quite.
know a lot of old Marxists used to be anti-open borders. We're all aware, but I want to.
There's quite a few. I just want to point out that there's been quite a few sort of straw men levied about the position.
I think it was the first time anyone's brought up open borders. But if you don't,
well, no, not.
move on.
I'm not.
We're having a pedantic point about nothing.
I'm not making.
I mean, right now.
I'm gonna leave. I'm gonna leave. I'm gonna go now because it's like 1 a.m. in the UK, and like I don't particularly enjoy having people be rude to me on something that I was invited on. So I'm gonna go. Thanks for the.
Who's been rude?
Bye.
No one has been rude.
Bye, comrade.
Spoke like 40 minutes out of this thing.
I mean, she has been talking over people too, but
she's good. That was performative.
That's called natural selection.
No, that was solid. That was good.